Velkommen alle sammen! Been meaning to do this video for a while. Very important. When I've said that the gods are symbolic for certain natural phenomena, things in nature, and even things in our own bodies, and that the myths are not real events that should be taken literally, that makes some people believe that we are atheist, and that's absolutely not what it is. It means we are animists, same as every single other human being. If we go back far enough in time, they had these beliefs. The sun and the moon were not just rocks up in space like we think of them today. Ancient humans believed that these things had a spirit and they worshipped it as a god. Same with just about everything else in nature: the earth, soil, trees, thunder, storms, even seasons, and even emotions like intangible things. Humans believed all of those to have a certain spirit and even a consciousness, and they were worshipped as gods. I've done plenty of other videos on that. You can go check them out. I'm not going to go on that here. What I'm going to speak about here are the sources. How do we basically know that the gods and deities and myths are actually symbolic and metaphorical? Well, I'm going to tell you all here. So, the absolute very first thing to go over. The evidence is all there in the language. If you just read, a generic translation of our myths, the poetic or prose Edda, they're gonna simply sound like fairy tales. But if we look at the actual translation and meaning of the gods and deities' names, we see a very different story. You all know many of these. The gods Sol and Moni are some. They are gods, but their names mean the sun and the moon. They are personifications of the sun and the moon. Very simple. What are the names of the two wolves that are chasing the sun and the moon and trying to devour them at Ragnarök? Skul and Hati. Translated, those mean treachery and hate. Those wolves were called. So somehow that myth works together, and ancient humans believed that through treachery and hate, and if that grew enough and got close enough to the sun and the moon, that put them in danger and might lead to that destruction. It's open to interpretation. We don't know exactly what that symbolizes, but we do know that they do symbolize those words. You all know Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin. Their names, directly translated, mean thought and memory. You think they aren't symbolic of thoughts and memories? Of course they are. So those are the things. Look at Thor and his mother, Jul, which means earth. Very simple translation. Of course, this goddess is a personification of the earth. You see, every single god's name has a translation, whether it be in Old Norse, or sometimes we have to look even further back to Proto-Germanic and even Indo-European translation. But every single god's name had an original meaning, and it symbolizes something. That being said, they are definitely not all that easy, right? As Sol and Moni and Jod and so on. We have some very, very vague translations of other gods, like Thor, whose name originally meant thunderer, or Odin, who means the frenzied one, or Lord of the Frenzied. The main gods that are more central in the myths, they usually have a much more vague and complicated translation, and their full meaning is not clear. If you ask me, probably about 50% of all the deities and gods in the myths have a pretty easy translation, and it's very easy to see what those things symbolize. The other 50%, it's a coin toss. We can come close, but it's definitely not clear, and we will never know for sure, but we can at least be certain that they had an original meaning, and the symbolism was actually understood by humans at some point. Debatable how far we have to go back for that. Sometimes we have to go back all the way to Indo-European times when we were all one people 6, 7, 8,000 years ago, because those gods' names are often very easy. They have gods' names that literally meant fire or wind or storm and so on, things like that. So definitely the oldest sources, it's easier to see. The problem is the Norse sources are written by Christians, most of them quite a bit after official pagan times, and most of them with direct and clear censorship meant to make pagan beliefs sound stupid and unbelievable. That's what they were trying to do. And even then, those myths and sagas were about the Viking Age and those times. And even then, in the Viking Age, it was already a time where the general public was losing understanding of their native religion anyway. So those are the only sources that we really have left, okay? So we have to realize that we are not going to find the easy answers just there in front of us in some old text. The reality is we have to recreate these things and use our brains and try to come to the understanding of what a religious leader had in the Viking Age, not the regular person, because they would have not understood the myths super well either. We're trying to get to the understanding that a religious leader or Gothi or guru, we can call it, might have. You know, just like there is a billion people in India, but very few of them understand what Hinduism is really about. There are, you know, really only a handful of gurus who have true understanding of that. The Norse world would have been exactly the same, except we don't have any gurus left in the world. We are trying to become them today with the little information that we do have. But we do have plenty of sources that send us on the right direction, so getting back to those right here. First, we can say two very important sources, and that is Skaldskaparmal and Hotatal. So those are both in the Prose Edda book that was written in the 1200s by Snorri, who most of you know who was a Christian, but he did include some really great information, and it is valuable. Now, if you read those first 3 sections of the Prose Edda, it's going to sound also like fairy tales and myths, unbelievable things. But if you read those last 2 sections, Skaldskaparmal and Hotatal, we start to get a lot of answers. And in there you will find a list of kennings and heities, which are basically Norse poetical metaphors involving gods' names and other ways to refer to the gods. Those are way too long to go over here. I might just put up a couple examples on the screen, but you can read about it yourself. If you don't have the Prose Edda, I carry my favorite translation of it in my online shop, and as always, I make sure the books that I sell on there are as low or even the lowest prices as you will find on the internet anywhere. I work hard to do that. On to the next source. Maybe we'll talk about the more modern sources first before we dive into the ancient ones, because a lot of people will ask about those. Pretty much every scholar and university professor on the subject in the past 200 years has had some interpretations as to what the myths symbolize and what they originally meant. Now, a lot of the people that are new to paganism may think that I'm saying something new here and that I'm making these wild claims and it's just me, but this is something every scholar on the subject has at least had a few interpretations on in the past 200 years, you know, the real meanings of the myths and what the gods represent. The problem with those scholars and all of these works is almost none of them are taking a real systematic and organized approach to interpret every single myth in the mythology. They will take one myth here and there, maybe a couple, but they don't really examine the entire mythology as a whole. Not holding anything against them just because it's so much fucking work to do. I'm writing a book about this myself, so I know it's taking things and you have to make sure it lines up. It's like a massive quantum mathematics equation and you have to fit this god here. Oh, does that fit? Does it fit here? Does it fit in that other story? Oh, what about this story too? How do the two gods relate here versus here? It's very difficult to do, so I don't have anything against the authors or scholars who aren't trying these things, but there are people trying them. But if you want a few of my favorite sources, Hilda Ellis Davidson, any mythology books by her, Maria Kvilhaug, Vegard Solheim, Vargviken 2, they're all ones doing a good job at examining the whole mythology. Their works are definitely not complete, and I don't agree with all of their interpretations, but there is really no other authors that are even coming close to doing as comprehensive of a job as those four, so I definitely recommend their books for ideas, if anything else. So done there, those are the modern sources. I also did a video about that I might put in the link below. Now we're speaking about the very ancient sources. These are the ones from long before the Viking Age, when the Norse and Germanic peoples were actually closer to the tribal and animist understanding of their religion. Tacitus, a Roman historian, said that the Germanic people did not confine their gods to idols and statues like the Romans did, but their gods lived all around them and in certain places in nature. Okay, enough said there. That's what I've always been saying. Important to say about that, though, the Romans and Greeks at this time, they confine their gods to these statues and idols and worship them like that, like the Marvel cringe pagans do today. And the Germanic tribes were still animist enough to view the gods as a part of nature. I will say, though, don't dismiss Roman paganism at this time, because they were tribal and animist just a few hundred years before this, and they would have been the same thing. And it may not necessarily mean at this time, when the Romans worshipped these Marvel character-like statues and idols as their gods, but they used these statues for ritual, to affect the forces of nature and the gods and what they represent. And I'll speak about that in just a minute. That's the main possibility that even the old Roman sources said. Also, another possibility, the reasons for these statues that were used in Rome and Greece and all kinds of other pagan places around the world, is that they built these things in hopes that the gods would come visit and even take residence in these statues sometimes. This is a belief that many cultures have around the world, that rocks and stones, things built out of that, are desired living places for spirits and ancestors and even gods. A lot of tribal peoples around the world believe that. Even the civilized people in Burkina Faso in Africa still today have a very strong belief in this and are known for their statues. It was probably the same in ancient Rome and everywhere else. It wasn't that their statue was their god. They didn't worship the statue, but they built these in image of what thought that a god might associate themselves with, in hopes that that actual spiritual entity, that god or the spirit of an ancestor, would come and live in that statue. That's what they believe in many places in the world. Just a thought, though. We don't know if that happened in ancient Rome. Next source, we should really call these a series of sources. They're called interpretatio graeca, romana, and germania. I did a longer video on this before, so you can check that out. I'll link it will be in the description. But Roman and Greek authors from very, very ancient times were writing about the translatability of the gods, and that the gods were called different names in different places. Greek, Roman, Etruscan, Egyptian, Phoenician, Hindu, all these places that Greek and Roman authors of the time had contact with and observed these different pagan cultures at a time where they were all still pagan everywhere. And it's just that different cultures referred to these gods by different names, and they molded them into different forms with their statues and paintings, but the gods still referred back to that same spiritual entity no matter where you were. I don't quite agree with that. I don't think it's that simple. The general idea is right, I think, but either way, I think we have to take these old scholars' words for it, that this was true, because these sources are from more than 2,000 years ago. And okay, so I think it's fair to say that these Greek and Roman philosophers and historians understood pagan religions and relations between the spirituality of these cultures a lot better than we do today. I think that is safe to say, so I can take their word for it, even though I think it's a bit more complicated than what they express in their works. You can take a look here. The Norse and Germanic gods are super easy to fill in everywhere pretty much. There's a great chart, and the original sources are on the Wikipedia page, and that's actually pretty good. I will put a link below there. Finally, to finish the video off, we'll go into some foreign sources. The Greek and Roman ones are very valuable because there's a great tradition, like I said, of philosophers and really smart people looking at these spiritual questions and the gods and the beliefs and the rituals. And in these places, they actually wrote it all down, and the texts have lasted the ages. Other pagan cultures, of course, cannot say the same about this. They have almost no text, but make no mistake, All pagan cultures had their geniuses and philosophers. The Germanic world would have been no different. It's just that we don't have any still written records of these sources in the north of Europe still existing today, but they would have been there. These philosophies would have been there. First one, a Roman philosopher named Sallust in the 1st century BC. I'm showing you just one excerpt here, but this book is, in my opinion, maybe the most valuable of all the ancient sources on paganism, and the myths and the gods and the ritual. And it's only about a 20-minute read, so I would definitely recommend reading the whole thing. But here you go. This excerpt is basically just saying how the gods are not physical beings and not confined to any body, but instead they are all a part of each other. Again, it's a summary. Read this whole book when you get a chance, and I think it's free online some places too. Another source from Celsus in the 2nd century, and his basically criticism of Christianity. He was a Roman pagan involved in the debates when Christianity was kind of taking over, when it was about to become, everything that it was in ancient Rome when the Holy Roman Empire started. The Christians were accusing pagans of worshipping idols and statues, and then Celsus said that the reason pagans built the idols is not to say that the gods are literal superhumans depicted, but to depict them in a way that the culture can understand and that captures the spirit of those particular gods so that they can better connect with the humans during sacrifices and ritual. Sallust, the one I just mentioned, said the same thing in chapter 18 of his book 300 years before. So this is a very, very valuable source and philosophy. And this is very important to understand too, because we actually do have some very legit old sources that mention the gods as being real humans. We definitely have reliable sources like that they were ancestors of kings in Northern Europe. But first of all, for those that point out that these were actually the real gods and they lived at one time, these stories that we read about in real sagas and chronicles about the gods are very different than the myths we read about the gods. And the historical texts, many times mentioning the gods, have nothing at all to do with the myths most of the time. But yes, in some occasions, there does seem to be humans living at a certain time in those stories that were told to have at least the same names as the gods. But there are many logical explanations for this, which I have done a video on. But one of the explanations for this topic is that humans would usually dress up as what might attract the spirit of a god as a ritual. And they built these statues in order to perform rituals like that, in order to actually influence the forces of nature to do what they wanted it to do, such as make it rain, or make the sun come back, or bring fertility to the crops. We have records all around the world of humans doing exactly this, dressing up like their gods or creating statues of their gods, the Norse world included, and using this in a ritual. It's just a clear example of animism and sympathetic magic, which I also did a video on that you could check out. Finally, a third source from almost 600 BC, a really old one, a Greek philosopher saying this famous quote that is still used by gurus and spiritual leaders today, that the humans of a population or culture create their gods into images and idols according to their own image. Like I also always say, the god is not this superhuman Marvel character in human form. We humans create these gods in whatever aspect of nature or divine energy that the gods are in a way that we can recognize and understand. This is what the images of the gods are, and why ancient philosophers saw the translatability of different gods from different cultures. But the gods are no different wherever you are in the world. The only difference is the way native cultures perceive them and mold them into human form, resembling themselves, but the gods are not in human form. So that's all I'll say for today. Long video, but hope that helps. Those are only a few of the sources here. I'm sure there are lots more. I know I probably missed a lot of them that show this same point, because I'm not familiar with that many sources outside of the Germanic world, but I know a lot of you are, so please include them down below below in the comments if you know any, but hope this video helps on all of your spiritual journeys. That's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.